Good evening, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to be here. I've been so looking forward to coming along and having a chat about Enid, and particularly in the area where Enid worked and was very productive. I'd like to, before I begin, acknowledge that I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I acknowledge their continuing connection to lands, water and community, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to say how very grateful I am for the response to the help wanted, and I'm so appreciative to the Historical Society for putting that in, and special thanks to Merle, Louise and Annette, who've been corresponding with me, and it's been such a treat to see what they have in their collections, what their mothers made, what they made, what their children were wearing. It's an absolute treat, and I know there will be some things to show you a little bit later on. In terms of my talk tonight, I'll just outline a little bit of what I want to speak about. There is so much to the story of Enid that I've been trying to pull it down and make it a little bit more succinct for you. But in general, just as an outline, I'm going to talk a little bit about her body of work, who the woman was behind the work, her early life and a bit of background, her professional beginnings, her marriage and family life in Heidelberg, the business expansion, her legacy, and what we're looking at now in terms of Enid. She is quite an amazing woman. I first got to know the work of Enid Gilchrist when I was doing my PhD, and I was looking at fates and bazaars, and of course there was a book on fates and bazaars and things that she'd made for those. So in summary, and it's a very brief summary of her many talents. She was a fashion designer, a pattern maker, she was an innovator, author, teacher, entrepreneur, she was a working mother, and she was a Heidelberg local. Her body of work includes 66 publications, and these are ones that there are also multiples as well as revisions, and many were reissued up to 4 times. These were sold, this is a sample here, these were sold through newsagents and via direct ordering through the Argus and the New Idea. The ones that we're looking at here are from my own collection. I have not found anywhere a complete set. So I have been progressively buying and collecting them, and I have now reached 66. But I have seen also on a couple that I haven't got, it's got a little sort of tag saying, oh, revised copy or something a bit different. And when I compare with the ones that I've got, sometimes there'll be 46 pages, sometimes there'll be 48, and there'll be new ads. As they grew in popularity, they'd quickly churn out another one. So it's a movable feast. But if you look at the library or National Library, State Library, they're not there. And the other thing, which is very tricky, is none of the publications are dated. So it's. So
what years were they?
They were coming out really from the 40s to the 70s. So it's quite amazing, but it's quite a fun project really. I'm working with a couple of others, and someone bravely is going into the New Idea because it's only on microfiche at the State Library, so their eyesight will be worse than mine by the end of it. But trying to map, we find an ad and then we think, okay, so that magazine was coming out in that month or that year. So we're trying to track them. So it's been very interesting. So I've put up a sample so you can have a bit of a look at the breadth of the material. The first one, this little one, Clothes for Your Baby, which I've brought to share with you tonight, it's only about this big. And that was not published by the Argus or the New Idea. That was Enid's first book. And that came out in 1947. And we know that, thank goodness, because the principal of Emily Mack wrote the foreword and dated it. So I'm thinking, phew, there's one. So that's a beginning. 1975 is what's cut off there, which I've roughly dated this last one at. You can sort of see the difference in design. When Enid decided that she was not going to work any longer, the New Idea, which was her last place of employment, put out 2 sort of compilation ones, and that's Enid Gilchrist's children's ones, and there was also ones for baby. But unbelievably, they didn't date them either. So even into the 70s, so it's sort of 74, 75, that's a piece that we have to go back into the library and try and find out what was going on. If you think about the time period, 47 to 75, we're looking at 28 years. I know there's 66 known ones, and I know that they're about 46 to 50 pages each. So on average, Enid was putting out about 2.3, probably more, books per year. It was a very large production. As well as designing the outfits and drafting the patterns, she constructed samples of every piece that went into those magazines to check that it worked for photography and for the charity parades and the sewing demonstrations. We're continuing with the body of work. I thought I'd give you a bit more of a snapshot, but she was very much into the do-it-yourself sewing school. She developed a very easy drafting pattern, which you could use at home. And this pattern was the basis for all of her patterns and all of her work. She used very simple equipment. She said, get out, if you've got a big ruler, good. If you don't, it's okay. A set square can be helpful. You need a pencil. She laid out all of the things that you need and then described what to do. You started with a 0 and you measured, and it was all very easy, really. And it was about changing those things so that it suited your size, or if you needed a bit more room here or a bit of a change here, you could do it on your pattern. They were also very stylish and very contemporary. She kept up to date with fashion. And the other thing, which I find perhaps quite amazing, but I think it was the nature of the person, she answered every piece of correspondence. People were writing from everywhere asking for tips and help, and she was committed to answering those letters. And she had an enormous following nationally and internationally. As you can see from this slide, we're looking at her body of work, she designed from baby through to adult. She designed for all of life. She started with the baby wear because she had her own baby. And then she initially sort of mapped and followed the growth of her own child and the changing needs in the community. Continuing, a complete wardrobe. We've got fancy dress, we've got undies, we've got beach, we've got sleepwear. Whatever anyone seemed to want, and she did respond to people who, asked her things. She would design something and put it together. So it's really quite fascinating that there's 2 fancy dress books, and they are a hoot. When you look through them, but they're very clever, because she knew people had to do things quickly and not spend a lot of money, and she was very innovative. She also moved on to helping with homewares as well as fashion. And as I said, I discovered her when I was looking at bazaars, so I was reading through pinnies and things with great interest. But you can see there the homemaker book, maternity wear. There's 3 maternity wear publications, baby books, little coats and dresses. I'm just going to flip back so you can see these crisply in colour. Thanks, that's much better, and you can really see how they all pop. All right. And I meant to mention what an amazing design this is, because if we're also looking at Enid's work, we're looking at the design, the graphic design on the covers. And sometimes family members were doing them, which is fabulous. And you can see, when you look at these sample here, the dating. I love that one over in the first one, that 6s and 7s, that whose child is that who had to perform and look so excited for the party. Somebody's child, that's for sure. But again, a range of things, different styles. These maternity wear, there were 3 of them. The dolls are a fantastic piece of graphic design and changing situations. Right, back to fashion and home. And I want to talk a little bit about the evolving designs. And you can see here the baby books, how they've progressed from the early one on the far left over there, right away over here. That's the last one of the baby books up on the top that came from the new idea. And the same, look at the junior teens. Look at the attitude of those ones at the bottom with their hands on their hips and they're hanging out. These were local girls, neighbours' daughters, friends' daughters, all the way through to 10s to teens in the 70s. So it's quite. I find it quite amazing. And in the middle one, where they're meant to be, with their records, it's all happening. Enid constantly evolved. She reflected the changes in fashions, materials, the social style. Her work was contemporary. closer investigation is no doubt is going to reveal in the magazines that she reused and repurposed her basic pattern blocks. She would have been mad not to, and they were so strong anyway, so she would have been changing them. The spiral bound one that you can see up the top there is quite a thick book, and that's an unusual one because the Argus put that publication out as a surprise for Enid after she was out of action, because she fell ill and she was hospitalised with TB for 2 years. So her work sort of continued, but when she came out, they shared this surprise that they had put together for her. They'd put a compilation together of her books. Continuing with the evolving designs, for me, looking at these, and I think for many others who have now had the opportunity to see them in this way, it's a wonderful snapshot really of, you know, fashion history, terminology, its design, its changing social trends. I mean, and typography. I just really love looking at the contrast when we look at the early girl fashion to look where we've gone now. You know, the girls aren't wearing much in the way of clothes, the clothing's short. It's a complete contrast, and we can map that through Enid's collection of books because she was so consistent. I mean, she continued working for that entire time. The toddler clothes. The toddler books were immensely popular. They were big sellers, so the Argus and I think the New Idea continually wanted her to repeat putting them out. And again, we can see the changing styles that she adapted to, you know, this one on the far side, which is one of the later ones. And you can also tell by the price whether it's, you know, pre-decimal or post-decimal. And you can sometimes see they're 50 cents and the same sort of books out and it's 75 cents. Might have a few new patterns. So you can see the changing style there. And again, in the doll clothes, I think Merle's dolls' clothes have come from that first one that she shared the photos with. And now we're back to, you know, I think it was Chrissy and I've forgotten the other one's name, that you pulled its hair out of its head in the 70s. I don't know if anyone can remember that one with the red hair. You sort of yanked something. Yeah, you did. You pulled something and pressed something on its tummy and the hair went back. So she's, you know, adapting for those sorts of things. As well as her books, and I often think, gosh, you know, that's exhausting. Boy, you've produced, you know, at least 2 or more pattern books a year. Enid also had a weekly column. And she had a weekly column in the Argus, and then that was followed by the New Idea when the Argus closed. So for roughly 11 years, because it wasn't completely regular, first of all, at the Argus. She started in 46, but she didn't take up a regular spot until a bit later. So she was there for about 11 years. And then with New Idea magazine, roughly 17 years. So as well as producing her books, she had the deadline of producing a regular weekly column. And the column was a pattern. It was all the instructions. It was the works. And they came out in the magazines or in the newspapers as an instalment, or else you could also send in, you know, a stamped sort of self-addressed envelope and order the pattern sheet so you could get a complete thing in one go. So she was providing things in that way. And I thought these were quite lovely ones just to pop in as examples. You know, 1 frock, 5 styles. She's always thinking of economy. She's always trying to help out. She's so conscious as a working mother that people don't have money. They don't have a lot of time. It's got to be easy, but you've got to look good. And the dressing gown, you know, she describes you can make it this size, but don't worry, shorter will suit, you know, the older boy. So you can always there's always clever ways of making do. The woman behind the work. This is young Enid, really. You know, we've talked about her body of work, and now I think it's time to jump back in and meet Enid the person. This is young Enid Smith in her 20s, and she's on holiday in Mount Buffalo. And in this next photo, we have Enid again on holiday, and she's with her very good friend, a fellow designer, Mary Maxwell. And Mary Maxwell became her sister-in-law because she married Enid's younger brother, Jack. And they were very close friends and they loved doing things together. Ron Smith is Mary's son, who I have met. He's a delightful fellow, and he said they were just so young and stylish and just so gorgeous. They were both these working women out and about. I mean, they look gorgeous in what they're wearing at Mount Buffalo. And there's a couple of other shots where in their ski gear. So Enid was Enid Smith, and she was born into a very interesting family. It was a very creative, a very innovative family. They designed, they built, they painted, they wrote poetry, they were musicians, and they all ended up with a strong association with RMIT. The poem that's on that far side was in Alex Smith's book on home carpentry, and Ron Smith, that I just mentioned, writes poetry today. He's been sending me poetry that he's been writing about his mother and the project. So it's continued on through the generations. And the talent dynasty has continued again. You know, there's the grandchildren and the other children. If we look at the family here, we've got Alex Smith. He was really a groundbreaking innovator. He came out from England and he met Beatrice and they married down in Geelong. He was a cabinet maker, he was a head of carpentry at RMIT, he was a woodwork designer, he was a writer. He pioneered the do-it-yourself carpentry books and articles for Home Beautiful. So he really was quite an extraordinary person. And Beatrice studied art at school, and I suppose like so many other women, it's, you know, I cannot find any other information on her. I know that she was this amazing woman. She was very talented. She was described by the family as naturally talented in many ways. She was a homemaker. She was a most interesting person, but I've not been able to track where she went to art school or what she did. But in the homemaker publication that we saw before, which I think I've brought in to show you, some of her paintings are in there. So they've mined her paintings as an example of framing or doing whatever. And I've met with Ted's daughter, Megan, and she's got one of the paintings on the wall. And just by way of the family dynasties and connections, Ted had 4 children, and Megan founded the Australian Quilt Association. She's an art quilter, and her daughter quilts and has just been doing things in Paris, and the granddaughter paints. You know, it sort of rolls on and on and on. And Ron Smith, who was the only child of, you know, John, Jack, and Mary, he's very creative. His daughter is a public artist who works around the world installing public art installations. But they're all very sort of down to earth, and just this is just the way they operate. They're a very interesting family. A little sample of the family as artisans. That book on the far side, that lovely collage cover, that was actually done by Jack Smith, Enid's brother. So he did the collage. He was the one who was the electrical engineer, but he did so many other things as well, as they all seem to. And this is a sample of some of Alex Smith's publications. The Australian Home Carpentry Illustrated is quite a sort of, you know, solid sort of book. That had that poem in it. And there's a series of these smaller, they're sort of magazine size and thin. That one's, you know, carpentry in the garden. There's one, you know, in the kitchen. There's, I think it's maybe five different ones. And as I said, you know, Alex Smith, he initiated the do-it-yourself articles for Home Beautiful. And this was a whole new concept. And he had thought in his own mind that he wanted to, quote, write articles for the average husband, explaining how to make simple things for the home and how to do repairs. So that was his premise, you know, teaching and upskilling people, and you can really see where Enid followed that line. So early years with Enid Smith, they moved to what was called Croxton, which we now know as Thornbury, when Alex took up his job at RMIT. And she clearly demonstrated that, you know, she had artistic talents from, you know, early years. I have access to her unpublished memoir, and there's some really interesting stories. There's a story that the family loves to share of when she was very young. She was only 9. She appeared in a new dress that she had designed, cut out and made that morning. It was a fashionable dress. It was quite a slim-fitting dress with a little sailor collar. And she'd been sent down the street that morning into High Street to do some messages for her mum. And the mother said, you can buy some fabric if you like and we'll, at some point make you a dress. And so she'd bought the fabric. It was a mauve crepe and she'd bought a white trim. And she just sat down and done it, and then appeared in the afternoon in her new dress, and she was aged 9, to the mother's great surprise. She knew exactly what she wanted because she'd been looking in the newsagent's window and she'd seen some of the fashion magazines, so she thought, that's the one I want. So that's what she'd done. And her philosophy and her personal mantra towards problem solving and creativity was, what if? Try it anyway. And there's other stories of her knitting, the mother saying, oh gosh, that's a shame. You've done knitting and now there's a big hole. And she said, oh no, I've done that on purpose. I'm doing another thing with the knitting. So she was always looking at different ways to put things together. Would it work better? Could it be faster? Will I get a different effect? And I think that carried on through her life and design practice. As a teenager, she actually was ill. As a young girl, she got scarlet fever. I think a few children did at the time, and was off in probably Fairfield. And when she came out of hospital, her parents had brought her a big doll. And she thought, oh gosh, I'm a bit old for this. And it really was a big, large size one. But then it turned out that she started to design all the clothes for the doll, and she just loved it. And it was like a little mannequin model doll thing. She made complete wardrobes for the doll. She designed them and made them all. And then she was commissioned by the Herald to put her doll's clothes and designs in the Herald. And so I found one reference in 34, but that makes her a little bit old. That makes her sort of around 17, where the families talked about her being, a teen and excitedly putting these dolls' clothes in. So I'm yet to finish off that piece of research, but it just showed that she had that way of thinking. She started to design her own things for the dolls, and off she went. She was too young for university. Oh, I meant to say actually about going to Preston Girls Secondary, sorry, I skipped that bit, which was at the time a pilot school for the introduction of the domestic arts. She seemed to love it at school from the descriptions. She loved all the classes and meeting with the girls. They had a great fun life around the area with, tennis and going to the church and lots of activities. And she graduated as dux at age 15. And the school was very keen for her to come back, but she wasn't really interested and she hadn't really understood, why. But her parents, she was too young for university, and her parents saw that there was this course at RMIT, which was a brand new course, which was the arts course, but they'd included dress design. And they thought, why don't you go and do that for a bit? Fill in a bit of time, go and do that. And she thought, oh yeah, I'll do that. And then the school wanted her to come back, and she thought, no, I don't want to. And then she found out later that she had really topped the marks in art, and there was the opportunity to have an exhibition, and she thought, oh gosh, that was at the school, but she'd actually almost topped the art marks in the state. And so the school wanted her back because it was very prestigious, because once you'd hit that level, you could have an exhibition, and that was a lot of credit for the school. But she just sort of wasn't interested. She thought, oh no, well, her friends are going off doing other things. I'm not really interested. And a number of private schools approached them and wanted her to take a scholarship and go to the private schools. And again, she said, oh, no, I'm not interested. So, and good, the parents supported her, and off she went to RMIT just to fill in a bit of time there and see what she might do. When we talk about her working life, and again, this is, with her sister-in-law, Mary, from the memoirs, RMIT was great fun. She studied the art subjects as well as dress design and pattern drafting. And the course was very much a talent pool for people who worked in the manufacturing and textiles industry in Melbourne. And they had their eye on who was in there and what they were doing. And part of the course seemed to be that you went and tried out at different places, or you went to different manufacturing areas or shops. And it's interesting, she talks about she and one of her colleagues, Elvie, and it was Elvie Hill, who then went on, of course, to have the dress shop in Collins Street. They went to a place, but it was too sort of highfalutin for Enid. She didn't like it, the things, but Elvie did like it, and Elvie stayed there, and that seemed to set Elvie off on a completely different path. And she talked about going to another place where it was mass manufacture, and they were getting these youngsters or young people from the college to produce all this work, and of course just taking it. And they were sleazy in there, so she couldn't get away from that fast enough, as she describes. But at age 17, she was approached by the executors of the Pauline Reliable Paper Patterns, and this was a company that had been going for quite some time. It was situated in Smith Street in Collingwood, and both the sisters who had set up that company had died, and the executors were keeping the company running, and so they were looking for a designer, and they came across Enid and they offered her the job. Now, as a diversion, I must say I think a study of the Pauline patterns is long overdue. That would be a fascinating story and a piece of work to do. She accepted the role, and the pattern blocks and the pattern work was very good. So she was quite keen to work there, and there was a fairly small staff, I think, and they were getting designers in to do things, and she said, "Oh no, look, I can do that. I can sketch." So she started doing the sketches of what the designs are. And in terms of that green one, I've had a good study of the back of that pattern piece, and I can see that the handwriting and the way the things are lettered matches what's in Enid's books. So I feel absolutely confident. Again, nothing is dated or nothing is signed, nothing has a name, but I feel absolutely confident that that is one of Enid's, because I can see the way she's written the A's and the 2's. I think it's exactly the same, whereas this other one is a bit different. Now, I have put up here to this side, which is, I'm sorry, it's impossible for you to read, and I've only got a copy of that one. But during her time at Pauline's Patterns, this is a very key piece of work, because Enid was engaged to produce what was called a standardised infant's wardrobe. It was a modern approach to baby health, welfare, and sort of play-based development. And it's endorsed by all of those names at the top, everything you've ever imagined, the infants, the kindergarten association, the Tweedle, there's a whole list of things. They all worked together, and they wanted this range of clothing, because it was for the sort of the new way of bringing up children and rearing children. It was all about comfortable clothing to encourage movement and play. And of course, in retrospect, we can see that this really becomes a strong foundation for Enid's own work later, and the way she wants to raise her own child when she has one. During the time of working at Pauline's, and she was there for 10 years, she also taught night classes, and she taught them at Emily Macpherson in sort of dress design and pattern, and at Footscray Institute. And Mary Maxwell was a student at Footscray while she worked in other clothing areas as a designer. I think she was doing the repairs and alterations actually at Le Louvre for a while, Mary, and she went and did this Footscray course. And that's where they met. And when Enid was able to employ an assistant, she asked Mary to come across to Pauline Patterns, and she did. And so they worked there together, which was lovely. And so their friendship, continued from having met in the course. And after a while, Enid gave up the teaching at night schools, because she just said, "What's this for? I'm working all day and I'm doing this and I'm actually having no fun." And of course, this is sort of during the war period as well. So there was, lots happening, and, she and Mary would go ice skating and different things. So we come to marriage, family life, and a home in Heidelberg. At age 27, Enid married Roy Gilchrist in 1945. She'd worked really from 17 to all the way up. She'd had a long and very successful career as a working woman. Roy had trained as a commercial artist and was a photographer, and he was working at the Argus. They initially lived with her parents in Shaftesbury Parade, and Enid had a baby who was called Neil the following year in 1946. When she was pregnant, Enid started planning and designing baby clothes for her new arrival, and I'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide, but it was a very interesting piece of work she was engaged in. And she took it back and she said, she was mapping it out, could she do it in different ways? And Roy took her ideas to the Argus, and that's what kicked off something there. So I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But if we come back to Heidelberg, Roy's mother gave them a block of land in Heidelberg, and that little red dot on the map is 424 Lower Heidelberg Road. And the house is still there. These are, contemporary images from it. And at the time, it was open fields with gum trees. There wasn't a lot around. There was a few sort of weatherboards, I think. But it was part of the Burley Griffin estate. And they asked Ted, her brother, who was, of course, the architect, to design them a practical home, and they used their savings, because of course we'd had Enid saving for the 10 years she'd been working, and Roy had been saving, so they had their money, and Ted put a design together for them. Ted noticed, or sensibly noticed, that whilst it was a thoroughfare now, Lower Heidelberg Road was a main road, and he put the bedrooms at the back. He said, I think this is going to be noisy. And so you can see here in this design, and not all bedrooms were there because there were shortages in building materials and supplies. So he put the footings in for something so they could, build it a bit later when they could get things. But that front lounge room, and Ron Smith remembers this, Mary's son, was her workroom and workspace. And they were doing all the photography, the design work there. And this little room to the side, which is now called a bedroom, had a massive wardrobe where all the samples were. And so you can see in this little piece, this is from an article on her in a magazine, saying, the large walk-in wardrobe, and they all remember that, and they used to set up photo shoots in this big room. And she was asked about, she was interviewed many times for different things in, women's magazines and various things about cooking. She was such a busy woman. She said, really, I'm not a great cook. She said, but I could make a pavlova. So it was, she was such a busy woman. It's not her forte. There's that little sort of kitchen tucked in there. So she focused on her other things. But this was their house. You can sort of see a little bit in this pattern. Sorry, it's a bit blurry, but there's this Glenard Drive, and a number of the friends and the connections she made lived there. And at the back of their house was all this open land, and everybody loved scampering around there and playing and catching up together. It was a fantastic community space behind there. They had moved in to this new house that we've just seen by the time baby Neil was about 9 months old. And that's when Enid began working on this publication, this little one. Prior to that, while she was drafting up her, baby sort of wardrobe for herself, she worked out that if she drafted up the patterns, she could sort of fit them by moving them around onto a sheet that was sort of a magazine size. And she said, this would be good because I could share that with other women and they wouldn't have to go and buy patterns, they could have mine. And that's when she showed that to Roy, and he said, they're starting a women's sort of magazine section at the Argus, I'll just take it and show them and see what they think. And they thought it was a great idea and said, okay, we'll bring in other things when you've done them. So in a sort of spasmodic way, she started to put things together in the Argus based on what she designed for baby Neil from her own wardrobe. Then she thought, what about a little book? So she put together this small publication. The Argus didn't produce magazines or books at the time, so but they helped her find a publisher. They suggested one. She designed the cover, and the publisher said, let me see if I can find some advertising and maybe that'll help cover the costs. Okay, so that was good. It got produced, but then they're looking at it and there's no distribution. It won't be accepted in any of the newsagents because there was those monopolies about what magazines went through those channels. Okay, not deterred, Enid packs up baby Neil in his nicest looking outfit, and there's a note that he wasn't such a grumpy baby by this stage, but she packs him up in a smart outfit, takes a batch of the books and carefully presses her samples, puts them in a suitcase, and she goes off into town. And she goes off on the public transport and she goes to Maya. And she goes to the Maya needlework department, and she happens to talk to the head person there, who wasn't very interested to start with, but Enid pulled out her samples, and then she was very interested because of the quality and the finish. So she said, okay, leave it with me, let's see what we can do. And so they took a stock of the books, they took the samples, and they put a little ad in their own Maya advertisements, and then they took a corner of the Lonsdale Street store and they set up sort of a diorama display of a child's bedroom with the bassinet and the other furniture, and her clothes through it with some, I think, dolls dressed in them. And it was a complete sellout. So they rang and said, we need more books. This has just been fantastic. And Enid felt it could be attributed to the fact that she had a little bit of a following already through her Argus work. Young women and young mothers were following her bits and pieces in the Argus, and when this appeared, off they went into Maya. And I have put this photo here to share with you. This is Enid, this is Neil when he's a bit older, and I think it's Buster the dog, who appeared in many photo shoots as well. And it's probably their backyard or down in that sort of spare land at the back. And I really wanted to share this little piece of the swim shorts so you could have a bit of a look. It's just showing you how she put the patterns together. This is one you would have purchased. You would have, in some of the magazines, they had bit by bit as a sequence. You kept going every week, but you could write away. But what is so interesting, if you read on, designed with a pair of built-in cotton jersey underpants that could be cut from discarded underwear. These shorts would look most effective in printed cotton, denim or satin-finished rayon. She was all about using what you had. Of course, there was fabric shortages too after the war. Material wasn't easy to come by. There were the shortages. And there are a number of her patterns that say, have you got some old adult underwear? You could cut this up for the baby, or you could make this out of some of the nappies, or you could line this with the nappy. It's always a tip to help people over that little hump, that economic hump. There's always little tips. And there was a very funny one in one of the magazines I was looking at recently. It was for a little girl's underpants, and she said, little girls are often chubby and they can't keep their pants up. Here's a tip. So in the front, make 2 buttonholes and sew buttons onto their vests, so no one's pants are going to drop off. So she had all of these tips to guide young mothers and people with growing families. In the area that they were living, in the Heidelberg area, there was a very strong community that had sprung up, and there were similar couples with young babies. And as I said, they were all loving going and meeting in the common ground at the back of the houses. Enid and a number of the other young mothers were approached by the local vicar to come to the church and come to the women's groups and various things. And so she decided that they'd go along. It wasn't the Methodist church that she was part of. I think it was the Anglican church. But anyway, a group of them went along and they decided they'd become part of the Mothers' Union because they liked the fact of getting out and socialising, and they were known as the smart set. They'd dress up and pop their gloves on and go down with their babies for company at the Mothers' Union. But she declined to join the group that was making and sewing for the bazaars and all the charity things. She said, I have enough of that in my daily work, so I'm just going to skip that bit. But they loved going down there, and it was a very strong set. And from this whole set, and there was names such as Molly, Shirley and Gwen, who are all her local friends, they were the group that then fed into helping with all the magazines and all of the connections. And there's a very telling thing. Yes, they'd got their house, and it was probably pretty Spartan, and Enid was very sick of the wooden floors, so she decided she would go back to work and she would do a regular Argus column because she really wanted to pay for carpet. And that's what drove her back with baby Neil as a working mother to start furnishing her home. I've popped this up because there's some Heidelberg local talent here. So with Neil growing, they went to Heidelberg Kinder, and everybody was moving in the same circles. she started to progress from the baby wear, to toddler, to kindergarten. She could check her designs on the neighbouring children. And apparently there was Calvin and little Colin Muir, who I keep hearing about, little Colin Muir, whoever he may be, and Gay and Kay. They were people that, she'd test the clothes on, and then they'd be modelling them. And supposedly, possibly, on that far side is little Colin Muir, because even Ron Smith said, "Oh, it's little Colin Muir." Everyone seemed to know little Colin Muir, whoever he was, who lived locally, and then appears in other books, as they're growing and getting older, which is great. So the books kept extending. Toddler clothes, as I said, were very, very popular. They went to kinder, they went to school, and the pattern books followed. So local children were trialling and modelling the photos, and I would absolutely love to find some of these children and to hear their stories, to see what exactly was happening. So the books continued in rapid succession with these continual revisions and rewritings. There was just so many of them. The Argus articles were more varied in their content because they were in response to letters and requests for help. And so there might be a little hat or a cap, or they weren't as sort of age progressive as the books were. Books, articles, and more books. I've popped that end one. I think that's possibly Neil when he's a little bit older, who's on the front there. And there's those teenagers with attitude in the middle for us, again. And the doll's clothes. So, as things arose, as there was a need, she would work to meet that. She often said that most of her inspiration and her new ideas came from people writing to her and asking, "Could you? I need," or "Could you help me with this?" And that's where the new ideas came from. I'll just jump to this one. Ooh, I think something's dropped off there, but never mind. Success, charity work and help, as well as doing the magazines or the publications. They were books, so some of them were 50 pages, and doing the column for the newspaper or for the new idea. Enid was called upon to give demonstrations, talks, fashion parades, lectures. There were so many requests from schools, kindergartens, mothers' clubs, the church groups, because her presence could be used to help raise funds. And I know that someone who's corresponded with me, another Annette, said that she was in a charity fashion parade, and she couldn't quite remember whether it was for basketball or for the church, and she absolutely remembers the item, and she described it to me. She may be here today, that she wore, and there she saw it in one of the magazines. It was a unisex one. In addition to this local interest and following, she had large international followings. Her books were being sold and used in Uganda, India, Britain, Malaysia, the USA, New Zealand. The patterns were used for school and kindergarten uniforms. The doll patterns, were republished in Sweden. She had articles in the Indian Sewing magazine. So there was all of these things swirling around as well. And the 1950s to the 70s, saw mass business expansion. And she'd sort of been doing this in sort of quite a folksy sort of way. They were doing it from home and doing it in bits and pieces, but in the end, it was just sort of beyond them, and they had an accountant come in and say, "Look, what are you doing, really? You've got all these things happening. You need to structure and get a bit of a business model happening, and you need to do things differently." It was very much sort of a cottage industry. So Enid then went and employed neighbours and friends as staff to help her meet the public demands, to run the fashion parades, to be the compares, and to do some of the secretarial work. So as well as working herself, she actually supported the other working women with young children in the area by paying them to do parts of the jobs, which was terrific. And, they had a great time. But of course, unfortunately, we've only got their first names. Though I know that Shirley, who was a big helper to her, her husband became the mayor of Heidelberg. And I did check back and find that at one point. But there was Betty and Joyce, who were comparing parades and helping with the demonstrations. So trying to track down all of those other details of this workforce that was part of the Enid Enid business in a way, or the Enid cottage industry. I mean, they must have had a hoot because they seem to all love it. Her family were also on board. Mary assisted with the design and she took on some of the publications herself. So there's a few now that I can see that change in style after looking at a collection as a whole, and from talking to Ron, her son, Mary did some of the publications. Because I kept thinking at the time, while she's hospitalised, and she was ill for 2 years with TB, who was holding everything together and how was it all working? And Neil had to go and live with others. And so Mary stepped in and she was designing things. And anything that Mary worked on, she got all the full commission for. And other things that they, part worked on together, they shared commissions. And many of those craft type things, like the bazaars, the pinafores, the dolls, Mary, the fancy dress, had Mary input. And Ron said to me that the high-end ladies' fashion, because Mary was actually a fashion designer as well as a pattern maker, she was instrumental in those too. So they sat underneath the Enid Gilchrist banner, but other people were helping. Mary was a big help. But cover designs were done by family members. There was they were modelling in the fashion shoots. There was the photography, proofreading, and her mother Beatrice often drove her because Beatrice had a car, and I don't think that Enid did, and I don't know that she was such a great driver anyway. And so her mother used to drive her around to various appointments. So the whole family pitched in to try and help and keep all of this running, because it had become enormous, really supplying answering the things from local, national, and then she was getting all these letters from, I read one from a group in Africa who were writing about their clothes for their kindergarten uniforms and all sorts of things. And I spoke with her son some years ago, and he said Mum answered everything. She just answered everything. So thank goodness she did get one of these local women to help her as a secretary. In later life, she and Roy, her husband, were also attending overseas trade fairs with the product. They were asked by the government to go over, and they travelled, to various countries, setting up, I think it's, for want of a better word, a trade fair, selling their goods and talking about the products. So they were doing that as well. So she was incredibly busy. So why did Enid stop? Now, the reason that she stopped, one of the key reasons, was the introduction of metric. It became a legal requirement that everything needed to be now metric, not imperial. Most of Enid's publications were in imperial, but she did put out some, and I've listed a couple here, some of these later ones, which were in metric, and she had some where she had conversions into metric, or she had dual ones, but she found that the women who were using them didn't want to adapt and change from imperial to metric. And it's a bit odd because quilting things really are still in imperial anyway. It's sort of a bit unusual. But anyway, it was legal and you had to do it. And she put out some books that had patterns in both formats, in imperial and metric. But then she said, oh, this is useless for these women and these sewers. They're only getting half as many. This isn't any good. This isn't working. So instead, in your 46-page book, you had half the number of patterns that you used to get. So she wasn't happy with that, and she didn't think people were getting value for money. And then she did investigate. She and Ron investigated continuing sales to countries such as Canada that were still using imperial and others, and they went over and there was various meetings and things. It just sort of didn't gel. And in the end, she said, oh, let's just stop. Let's just stop. It's just too hard. And she'd been doing it for a long time. And she and Ron had been up to Queensland and they liked the look of it and they thought, oh, perhaps they might retire there. Along the way, various, family members had died and people had changed. I should add, actually, that her brother Jack, who was married to Mary Maxwell, died young. He did have an ongoing illness from childhood, and I don't know whether it was a type of asthma thing, but he died at about age 38. And so Mary was left as a single parent, working, to support Ron, her son, continuing to work in various guises in the fashion industry. So, their friendship groups were changing. Heidelberg had changed. They thought, okay, let's stop. And they decided that they'd go up to Queensland. They'd retire up there. When we think about the keys to Enid's success, there's a combination of factors, and I certainly haven't, grasped them all from my research. She's so worthy of a thesis or a PhD or an intensive study because of the work that she was doing and the impact on the Australian fashion industry and home sewing. But she did have very simplified, as you can see here, easy ways of drafting a pattern, and this ensured success. There was no need for fancy equipment. She'd say, the big ruler, you've got a set square, you can do it, you need some big paper. And what is so lovely in so many of the books, that I've purchased, they are filled with folded up newspaper, patterns stretched out on the newspapers, on Christmas wrapping paper, on, computer paper, all sorts of things. So she said, it's easy. You just need a pencil. You probably need chalk for this if you're marking it out on this and that. So that was good. And as I perhaps didn't explain very well before, but you started with, you can see up the top, a 0.0, and then you measured out. So, okay, you want the arm shorter? Let's do it. You could just adapt it. You're a little bit plumper? Let's change it. So it was very easy and structured and straightforward. I have a colleague who has been making some of the garments from Enid's early book, and she is a costume maker, and she was scampering ahead, and she said, I'm just not getting this. And she went back and she started to follow the Enid method, and she said, I absolutely get it. And that is so much better in terms of the fullness around where the arm is stretching. She said, I absolutely get it. She was right. And I have been using a newer method of, because she has done drafting and fashion drafting, and it was not as good. I should have stuck to Enid. And now she's going back to mapping them out. But so that was interesting that they have lasted through time into now. As well as the simplified designs, her fashion was timely, it was contemporary. She apparently introduced the Hawaiian long shorts into Australia after she'd seen them in Hawaii, and she did other things. When she travelled, she collected magazines, she took note of what was there, and she brought that back to Australia and adapted what she could to our climate and our lifestyle. She was always looking for what was new, what could be used. So nothing was looking, I suppose, old-fashioned. Economy, as I've discussed, reusing existing fabrics and materials. In some of the doll ones, there's, look in your scrap box. You'll find something for this. You can make do. And someone described to me their school dress. It was a party dress, actually. It wasn't a school dress. And it had the biggest hem. She said, of course then, Mum let it down because it was an Enid Gilchrist, and then the braid was sewn around the mark, where the hemline had been. So there was always ways of doing things. And she would describe talking about, don't worry, you don't need a big piece of fabric for this. You won't have it. It'll be more expensive. But you can halve this here, put a join in, and why don't you have a different pattern in that skirt, or mix and match, or make different things. So she was always looking at ways to use things in an economical way, which was still very fashionable. And she was rigorous. She tested, she ensured that the patterns worked, the garments looked stylish. She had a very strong sort of work ethic, I suppose, that came through the family. Everything was spot on. And she also offered a very strong service of support and advice. She really was excellent at her work and at her job. And on top of that, she was a very approachable woman. People could relate to her. She gave generously of her time and expertise to support local charities, and from all family accounts, she was genuinely lovely and very gracious. I think I'm missing a couple of slides that were there earlier, but one project that she did work on, I think the images have dropped out, was Project Vietnam. So when she was with the New Idea, she was working with the Red Cross, and she had done some work with them, and she designed a very simple sort of t-shirt, sort of long-sleeve t-shirt, which could be made for all the children who are now refugees in Vietnam. And he said, now remember everyone, think about the climate. It's going to be hot there, so think carefully about your fabric. So there was a whole campaign which ran through New Idea of using this pattern so it could be sent over for the orphan children in Vietnam, one of her sort of simpler patterns. So she was always helping out, and in terms of those school fashion parades and charity fashion parades and those lectures and things, she wouldn't take a fee and she wouldn't sell her book. She said, no, this is my opportunity to give back. I don't have a lot of time to work in other ways to give back to charity, but I can do this. And so she was always trying to help out. So I think she was very approachable and genuinely very nice. Her career really was phenomenal. If she was around today, I have no doubt she would be a high-profile influencer. She'd be on the social media because that was happening behind the scenes in what she was doing. In terms of, and there she is at Chelsea Beach, young Enid. In terms of her legacy, she was awarded in 2000 the OAM, and that was for services to the community through the publication of books and articles for home sewing and patterns designed for Australian families and their lifestyle. But despite this prominence, this excellence, this influence, her legacy has received little scholarly attention. As I say, no one even knows how many books she's produced. Her values of longevity, of resourcefulness and maker empowerment remain highly relevant today. She was so ahead of her time, but she just has drifted and has not received any of the recognition that, really one would expect that she should have. The group that I'm working with has launched what we're calling the Enid Gilchrist project to bring these achievements to light. We've got a not-for-profit entity. It's just called the Society for the Advancement of Everyday Visionaries and Makers. And Enid is our first project. And Mary Smith, whose life is entwined, is the second. And there is just so much material out there that the fact that these women were looking at, I think, decorative arts, applied arts, that's why they haven't got the recognition. It's fantastic to see, as I'm sure all of you have noticed and have been going to the exhibitions, to see that women artists and printmakers and ceramicists are now beginning to move into the spotlight and receive due recognition. Hasn't happened yet for people like Enid and Mary, who were in the decorative arts, the applied arts, the industrial arts, called domestic arts, which is not such a fashionable term now, but they were highly skilled in their field. They were excellent. And part of our project of focusing on them is to bring these stories to light. And we're looking at them, through research, websites, and that type of thing. I'm going to finish up there, so you may have a few questions, and that really is the most brief overview of Enid and her life, but we're going to be putting something together at the Melbourne show this year. They just said yes this week, that we can put a small display to capture more information about Enid and to showcase her magazines, because if one could imagine an image of the 66 of those magazines blown up, people have no idea of the breadth of her work and what was going on in Australian fashion and for home sewing. So we've started the inroads. Her family has been supportive and helpful, which is great. Her son Neil still lives up in Queensland. Her nephew Ron, Mary and Jack's son, is terrific. He's also in Queensland. He's been down and he's coming down again, and he's been sending me, for example, things like these photos, going through whatever he can and trying to find things. So we're trying different avenues to track that down, because what a wonderful legacy. I mean, it needs to be in a collecting institution, all of this material. And I think it's so lovely that she was such a Heidelberg local. And thank you for having me here tonight. I've really been so looking forward to coming and talking about this.